They handed me the eviction notice like I was supposed to crumble. I didn't say a word. I just slid a faded document across the table, a 1923 water rights deed, and watched the smugness drain from their faces faster than a flood through a broken dam. My name's Jake Morrison. Army Corps of Engineers, third-generation Texan, and the man whose land the Willowbrook Estates HOA thought they could quietly steal while I was off serving 2 tours in Afghanistan. They built 35 luxury homes on my land, homes they thought would stand forever. But they didn't know what I was standing on. I still remember the first time I walked back down Pop's gravel road after deployment. The dust kicked up around my boots like it was welcoming me home. I was expecting golden pastures, our family's old cattle fence, and the glittering little dam my grandfather built in the 70s to manage rainwater and help out our neighbors during dry spells. Instead, I saw concrete trucks, foundation slabs, and strangers laughing in polo shirts like they owned the place. A bulldozer idled right on top of Pop's favorite oak tree. I walked straight up to the construction foreman. He barely looked at me before shrugging. "Sorry, buddy. Got permits. And everything. This is Willowbrook Estates property now." That's when I saw her, Maggie Thornwell, president of the Willowbrook HOA, riding up in her little white golf cart like some kind of suburban queen. Tennis skirt, oversized sunglasses, that syrupy, insincere southern drawl. "Your family abandoned this land, honey," she said, smiling like she was doing me a favor. "We're just putting it to good use, for the community." But what really broke me wasn't just the smugness, it was what they'd done to the water. The creek that fed Pop's dam, the one he built with the Army Corps for watershed control, had been rerouted. Maggie's construction crews had literally changed its flow. The water level dropped an inch a day, turning 45 years of flood control into a stagnant puddle. That's when I knew. This wasn't just a land dispute. It was war. I hired an attorney. Big mistake. He quoted me $85,000 just to challenge the zoning change. Apparently, while I was in a combat zone overseas, Maggie's husband, Rick, a sitting city councilman, had quietly reclassified my grandfather's property from agricultural to residential. Emergency zoning modification. Fast-tracked. All legal. On paper. What they didn't count on? I know paper. I know schematics. I know how to read between every single bureaucratic line. I started digging. The deeper I went into the county records, the more the lies unraveled. And then I struck gold, Pop's original dam permits, signed off in 1978 by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Turns out, this wasn't just a farm pond. It was federal infrastructure. That meant any interference fell under federal jurisdiction. Not HOA nonsense, but that was just the beginning. Buried beneath a stack of yellowed land ledgers, I found something even older, a 1923 deed granting my great-grandfather senior water rights to Willow Creek. Rights that trumped anything the HOA built. Rights that made every drop running through their fountains and decorative ponds technically mine, and they were stealing it. Maggie must have known I was getting close because suddenly the smear campaign began. Next-door posts warning neighbors about an aggressive veteran with questionable property claims. HOA board members parked at the end of my driveway, writing down license plates of anyone who visited. They called the sheriff, the health department, even the fire marshal. One by one, city inspectors showed up, citing me for everything from loud tractor noise to environmental hazards. They tried to bury me in bureaucracy, but I'd seen this play before. In Kandahar, in Helmand, in every town where corruption worked harder than the people it stole from. That's when I made the call. Tony Riggs, my old unit buddy. Now with the EPA got one phone call, and everything changed. If they diverted a creek without federal permits, Tony said, that's a Clean Water Act violation, and if your dam has Army Corps jurisdiction, he didn't have to finish. The clock was ticking. I installed trail cameras, measured flow rates, documented sediment samples, took time-stamped photos of every crew operating on my side of the line, and while Maggie threw HOA wine nights and posted about protecting children from unstable influences, I was quietly compiling a federal case that would drown her empire in red tape. But it wasn't about revenge. It was about legacy. Pop didn't build that dam for us. He built it for everyone downstream. For the Santos family farm, for the Chan's garden, for every neighbor who needed water in a dry season, and now Maggie wanted to turn it into a backyard ornament. They say some battles are won in courtrooms, but this one? This was going to be won with iron, water, and the truth, and the rain was coming. Why does justice always seem to move slower than corruption? That question haunted me every night as I sat on the creaking porch swing of Pop's farmhouse, staring out at the concrete skeletons growing where cattle once grazed. Foundation after foundation rose like tombstones on my back 40. And every morning, the water behind my dam dropped a little more, like the land itself was bleeding out. I wasn't just losing acreage. I was watching a legacy drown in silence. But Maggie's people weren't silent. She launched a full-scale harassment campaign so precisely orchestrated it could have passed for a military operation. Every night I'd find HOA board members parked across the road, clipboards in hand. One even followed me to the local hardware store, then posted online that I'd been aggressively stockpiling materials. It got worse when Rick, Maggie's husband, weaponized his seat on the city council. That's when the surprise inspections started. The building inspector showed up unannounced and declared my 60-year-old farmhouse structurally questionable. Told me my porch needed $8,000 in repairs. The fire marshal claimed my outdoor generator setup was a safety risk, even though it had passed inspection less than a year ago. Animal control came by the next day, citing me for unregistered livestock. I didn't even have livestock anymore. I recognized the tactic. It was a squeeze play, same strategy we'd used overseas to destabilize corrupt warlords. Hit them with enough overlapping pressure until they either collapse or beg to negotiate. But I wasn't some soft target. I was trained for this, so I started fighting back, not with fists, not with guns, with facts, paperwork, timing, precision. That's how you bring down an empire. Tony Riggs, my old EPA buddy, had already confirmed that Maggie's crew violated the Clean Water Act by diverting Willow Creek, but he wanted more, harder evidence. So I turned my living room into a command center. I set up water flow sensors at the inlet and outlet points of the dam. I installed 3 trail cameras along the creek's diversion channels, time-stamped to catch every illegal dump, every bulldozer digging where it shouldn't. I tracked rainfall, evaporation rates, and downstream shortages, and then I got the proof I needed. In one drone flyover, I captured a concrete truck dumping material directly into the diverted creek bed, blocking its original path like a cork in a bottle. The aerial footage clearly showed newly poured concrete forming a permanent channel, not a temporary redirection, as their permits falsely claimed. It wasn't just sabotage, it was fraud. Meanwhile, my sister Sarah called from California, pleading with me to just settle. They're offering $180,000, she said. Please, Jake, we don't need this fight. But it wasn't about the money. How do you explain to someone who's never set foot on this soil what it means to protect it? How do you describe the way Pop used to test creek water in mason jars after heavy rain? Or how he stored ledgers with handwritten notes about how much water the Santos family needed each summer? How he used to say, "Son, if you own the source, you protect everyone, downstream." This wasn't just dirt and water, this was history, duty, and I wasn't about to sell it off like surplus gear, so I doubled down. And that's when I found it. The original agricultural covenant Pop signed in 1978. Buried in a stack of mislabeled tax records, it spelled out the true purpose of the dam: to maintain natural seasonal flow patterns for downstream agricultural use in perpetuity. In perpetuity, that changed everything, because under Texas law, agricultural water rights often supersede residential development, especially if they predate the municipal system. I wasn't just allowed to maintain water flow. I was obligated to. Amanda Cross, a brilliant environmental attorney I met through a mutual veterans group, joined the fight. She had fire in her eyes and a law degree sharper than barbed wire. When I showed her the covenant, she didn't blink. "They've built their whole development on fraud," she said, tapping the paper. "If you open those spillway gates under the legal guise of restoring natural flow, it's not sabotage, it's enforcement." But Maggie wasn't done. She escalated. One night I woke to the sound of boots on gravel. Checked the cameras. Nothing. But the next morning I found hydraulic fluid leaking from the dam controls. Someone had tried to jam the gate valves. Tony helped me report it as sabotage, a federal crime given the dam's jurisdiction. But the sheriff's office dragged their feet. Martinez, the only honest deputy left, pulled me aside at the diner the next day. "Jake," he said, "they're building a paper trail on you. Wellness checks, noise complaints, mental health reports. They're trying to get you labeled unstable." Turns out, Rick had filed a request with Veteran Services for an emergency wellness intervention, citing erratic behavior and combat-related instability. The social worker who showed up looked almost embarrassed. "I'm sorry," she said. This doesn't feel right. They were painting me as dangerous, hoping they could declare me a public threat and force a court-ordered seizure of my land under eminent domain, and they almost succeeded. 2 weeks later, I got the notice. The city was scheduling a seizure hearing, citing public safety concerns over the dam structure. They were planning to invoke emergency authority and take my land at a fraction of its appraised value. The kicker? The hearing was scheduled for 2 days before the heaviest rainfall in 7 years was predicted to hit. They wanted that land flooded. Not by nature, by me. They were baiting me into a reaction, hoping I'd lash out, do something reckless, something they could spin as proof I was unstable. The local newspaper even ran a headline, "Troubled Veteran Blocks Community Progress." I stared at that headline for a long time. Then I got up, and I started planning. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about precision. Maggie and Rick had turned corruption into an art form. But I had my own masterpiece to paint, one spillway at a time. Amanda filed a formal petition with the EPA for an emergency agricultural water restoration demonstration. Tony arranged for federal inspectors to be on site during the operation. I gathered affidavits from every downstream neighbor, documenting how the creek's diversion had crippled their crops and destroyed their wells. Mrs. Chen brought over black and white photos of her father watering their family garden from Willow Creek in the 1940s. Miguel Santos documented 4 generations of farm irrigation from the same stream. We had history, we had science, and now we had the weather. The clouds were coming. Dark, heavy, and perfectly timed. I stood at the dam controls, Pop's journal in one hand, the permit covenant in the other. The hydraulic gate levers creaked as I tested their movement, slow and steady. It was all still functional. Pop built things to last. And now, it was my turn. The water would flow where it belonged. Maggie wanted to build a kingdom on stolen land. Then, she could have her lakefront property, because sometimes the only way to save a community is to remind it what real flood control looks like. You ever stand in the eye of a storm, knowing the real damage hasn't hit yet, but feeling it in your bones? That was me, the morning before I opened the spillway. The sunrise bled orange through the cloud cover, painting Pop's dam in gold, like it knew something big was coming. The old controls hadn't been touched in over 40 years, but under my hands, they hummed to life. Grease, dust, and the smell of oil clung to the morning air. It wasn't fear that gripped me. It was clarity. Pop didn't build this system to hold water. He built it to hold back greed. Maggie still thought she could control the narrative, that she could rewrite history with a press conference, a news crew, and the right hashtags. But facts have weight. Paperwork has power. And water? Water always finds a way. Tony called me with the update. EPA inspectors are en route, federal eyes on the ground by 8 a.m. Amanda was already in motion, filing protective injunctions, environmental filings, and whistleblower documents like a legal machine gun. We weren't reacting anymore. We were leading. But Maggie? She was panicking. Her next move proved it. She hired private security, not the kind with walkie-talkies and neon vests. The kind with tactical vests and too much testosterone. 4 of them posted up across the property line. Sunglasses, radios, firearms that made me question who exactly they thought I was. One of them had the audacity to walk up to my fence line and say, "We're protecting community infrastructure. Don't do anything stupid." It took everything I had not to laugh. I checked the trail cams that night. Caught them at 2:04 a.m., sabotaging my dam controls. One of them, wearing fingerless gloves and full camo like we were back in Helmand, was caught on tape jamming concrete mix into the spillway hydraulics. Another acted as lookout, holding a flashlight between his teeth. But they weren't alone. Deputy Rodriguez, tipped off by Tony, had been watching from the trees. He waited until they finished their sabotage, then stepped out with his badge drawn. Hands in the air. Now. You should have seen their faces. They tried to say I was the threat, that they were preventing terrorism. But it's hard to claim you're protecting the neighborhood when you're holding a sack of quickset concrete at 2 a.m. in someone else's backyard. By dawn, the first 2 arrests had been made. Federal agents were briefed. And Maggie? She was just getting started. At exactly 7 a.m., she went live on Facebook. Hair perfectly curled, makeup set like she was about to walk into Sunday service. This man, this unstable veteran, is threatening to flood homes. Our homes. With military-grade knowledge and unstable motives, she choked up. A well-timed tear rolled down her cheek. He brought back more than just trauma from Afghanistan. He brought weapons, and now he's using water as one. The camera panned out to show mothers clutching children, standing at the property line with signs that read, "Protect our kids," and "Stop the flood." Except there was no flood. Yet. I stood at the dam, watching it all unfold from my tablet screen. Calm, focused. Every drop behind that dam accounted for. Every inch of flow calculated. Maggie might have had optics. But I had precision. The final blow came when Rick played his last card. He fast-tracked an emergency restraining order through Judge Henry Walsh, the same judge who'd received $15,000 in campaign funds from Rick's construction firm. The hearing was scheduled for 6 a.m. the next morning, 2 hours before I was set to open the gates. Amanda discovered the connection. That night, "He's dirty," she said, slamming her laptop shut. "But he's moving fast. They're going to try to shut you down before the flood even begins." I didn't have time for court games. I had one job left. Make sure the water could actually flow. The sabotage had done damage. Enough to delay me, but not stop me. I worked through the night, clearing the hardened concrete from the control channel, with a jackhammer and steel pick. Sweat burned into my eyes. My muscles screamed, but every chunk I pulled loose was one more nail out of their coffin. At 4:30 a.m., with less than 2 hours before court, Maggie played her final hand. She called. The VA claimed I'd made suicide threats, that I was armed, that I posed a danger to myself and others. At 5:30 a.m., a social worker knocked on my farmhouse door. "Jake Morrison?" I opened it, face coated in oil and fatigue. She hesitated. "We received a welfare concern. I just need to ask you a few questions." Behind her, Maggie's security team watched from the shadows. It was all choreographed. The goal? Get me locked up before I ever touched the spillway. But I didn't panic. I answered her questions calmly, rationally. Told her about Pop, about the dam, about the court filings and the inspections. I showed her my permits, my data, my calculations. By the end of the conversation, she was nodding. "Honestly," she said quietly, "it seems like you're the only sane one out here. But that moment almost broke me, not because of her, because of Sarah." My phone buzzed. "Jake," she said, her voice cracking, "I just saw the news, the live stream. Are you really going to flood that neighborhood?" There was fear in her voice, not because of what I'd do to them, but what they'd already done to me. "Jake, please. I already lost Pop. I can't lose you too." I looked at Pop's journal sitting on the control console, flipped it open to a wrinkled page dated June 14th, 1980. Opened the spillway today. Helped the Santos family and the Chens. That's what neighbors do. That's when it hit me. This wasn't about rage or pride or proving a point. It was about restoration, about returning what never should have been stolen in the first place, about letting water go where it was always meant to go. At 7:02 a.m., with federal agents present, cameras rolling, and the entire neighborhood holding its breath, I placed my hand on the hydraulic lever. Then I pulled. The gate hissed, and the dam opened. Not a violent surge, a gentle, steady outpour. Water whispered down the spillway channel like a long-lost friend coming home. For the first time in 18 months, Willow Creek flowed where it belonged, through the original bed, over stones that Pop himself had laid, around curves that had guided generations of life and growth. No one's home flooded, no walls collapsed, no children screamed. It was just water, being water. Miguel Santos knelt beside the flowing current, scooped a handful of crystal-clear water, and let it run through his fingers. This fed my grandfather's cornfield," he whispered, tears streaking the dust on his cheeks. "For 60 years!" Maggie screamed from across the field, her mascara streaking in the morning heat. "He's destroying our homes! Arrest him!" But Agent Sarah Kim of the EPA stood beside me, calm and direct. "Ma'am," she said, "this dam is under federal jurisdiction. He is operating it within legal parameters. You are interfering with a federal inspection. It was over, and it had only just begun. Have you ever watched a lie unravel in real time? It doesn't fall apart all at once. No, first it trembles, then it splits. Then, if you've done your job right, it collapses like a mansion built on soaked soil. That's what Maggie's story did the moment the water flowed. The media was already there. 3 local news crews, 2 regional environmental reporters, and a drone team live streaming everything as it happened. What they captured wasn't chaos. It was beauty. The water didn't crash. It returned. It wound around poplar trees, soaked, back into the parched ground and carved its way through a channel it had always called home. You could practically hear the earth sigh in relief, and yet, Maggie tried to spin it anyway. With the camera still rolling, she charged EPA agent Sarah Kim and demanded immediate arrest. "This man," she shrieked, "has used military engineering, training to conduct environmental terrorism. Our homes, our children, are in danger." Agent Kim didn't even flinch. "Ma'am," she said, glancing at her clipboard, "we are currently observing a federally permitted agricultural flood control operation under the 1978 Conservation Covenant. So far, there's been no measurable damage to any residential structures." Maggie's face turned the color of a ripe tomato. But the unraveling wasn't done. Downstream, on Mrs. Chen's property, an irrigation line suddenly sprang to life for the first time in over a year. A small burst of muddy water gave way to a crystal-clear stream that rolled into the garden beds her family had tended since the 1940s. She dropped to her knees, touched the soil, looked up at the sky. Then she smiled. At Miguel's place, the stock pond his family had used for generations rippled with new current. His father, who hadn't walked without a cane in 2 years, stood up from his lawn chair and whispered, "I never thought I'd see it flow again." Local farmers gathered like it was a holiday. They brought folding chairs and home-cooked food. The smell of tamales, smoked sausage, and fresh tortillas drifted across the creek as families watched the spillway operation like it was a county fair event. That's when Maggie realized she wasn't the protagonist anymore. She was the villain in a story that had already moved on. Still, she tried. She went live on Facebook again, this time from her porch, panning over to her ornamental garden beds and muttering about damage, even though not a single drop of water had reached her fence line. The hashtags didn't trend. The outrage didn't stick because the people watching online saw something different. They saw Pop's Dam doing exactly what it was built to do. They saw a community reconnecting with something real, something stolen and finally returned. And then came the concrete trucks, 3 of them, sent by Rick. They arrived under the pretense of road maintenance, but instead of patching anything, the drivers began dumping wet concrete across the re-exposed original creek bed. Trying to block the flow again, EPA agents acted fast, federal officers handcuffed. The drivers on the spot for interfering with a federal environmental operation. One of them tried to argue. "I was told this was an emergency city order." "From whom?" Agent Kim asked. "Councilman Thornwell." "Thank you," she said. "That's all I needed to hear." You could almost feel the gravity shift. For the first time, Maggie and Rick weren't just playing dirty politics. They were committing federal crimes in broad daylight. Meanwhile, Amanda Cross was building pressure. Of her own, she'd filed whistleblower complaints with the Texas Insurance Commission and provided documentation of fraudulent coverage filings for the entire Willowbrook development. Her phone buzzed halfway through the spillway operation. She smiled. Then, held up her screen for me to see. All HOA insurance policies frozen pending investigation. Without insurance, construction halted immediately. Rick's development was now a naked investment sitting in a legal hurricane, but the true explosion came that afternoon during Rick's panicked phone call. Amanda was standing on the courthouse steps with a legal filing in hand when Rick's voice, loud and furious, blared over her speakerphone. "That lunatic is costing me millions," he shouted. "Get that judge to shut him down, or I swear I'll—" She hit record. Texas is a one-party consent state. Rick had just gifted us a smoking gun. By evening, the Willowbrook HOA was in chaos. Maggie's supporters dwindled. Some residents, quietly, began removing their lawn signs. Others crossed the creek to thank me. One man, probably in his late 40s, shook my hand, then looked away. "I voted to fund the HOA expansion," he muttered. "I didn't know. We weren't told." I didn't blame him. Maggie was good at playing savior, but her mask had slipped, and the face beneath wasn't heroic. It was desperate. At 7:00 p.m., we received word from Tony. The EPA had expanded its probe, not just into Willowbrook, but into Rick's old construction projects, too. Apparently, this wasn't the first time he'd used creek diversions to secure development loans. And now the feds were pulling every zoning file tied to his name. Amanda's grin stretched ear to ear. "This isn't just water theft anymore," she said. "It's interstate fraud." Still, I didn't celebrate. Not yet. I walked to the dam one last time that night, alone. The moon reflected off the spillway water like a silver blade. I could still hear Pop's voice. "You take care of the water, and it'll take care of you." And it had. Not with violence. Not with noise, but with proof. Tomorrow, the courtroom battle would begin. Maggie had already filed an emergency injunction, claiming I had damaged over $2.7 million in residential property. She had 2 lawyers, 3 expert witnesses, and a psychiatrist who'd never met me, but was prepared to say I exhibited revenge-based flooding tendencies. But we had Pop's journals. We had the 1923 water deed. We had EPA agents, farmers, neighbors, wildlife specialists, and satellite data. And we had something they could never forge. The truth. As I stood watching the creek dance under moonlight, a sudden breeze swept over the dam, carried with it the faintest scent of mesquite and cedar. It reminded me of something Pop once told me when I was 8 years old and scared to fish alone at dusk. "Don't be afraid of stillness, Jake. That's when the land talks back." Tonight the land wasn't still, it was singing. You ever walk into a room and know it's not just a room? That's what the courthouse felt like that day. Not a courtroom, a reckoning. The gallery was full before I even stepped through the doors. Farmers, reporters, Willowbrook residents with folded arms and uncertain eyes, the EPA agents, Amanda, and a small group of veterans who'd quietly shown up to sit in the back row wearing old unit hats and weathered boots. They didn't say a word. They didn't need to. On the left side of the courtroom, HOA board members, clutching legal pads and muttering among themselves. On the right, neighbors I hadn't even met yet offering tight nods and hopeful glances. At the front of the gallery, Maggie sat between 2 high-powered Houston attorneys dressed like funeral directors. Black suits, pearl cufflinks, matching binders labeled evidence. She wore a conservative dress and a faux expression of concern so perfect it could have won an Oscar. Gone was the tennis skirt and fake tears. This Maggie had sharpened herself for war. But she didn't know who she was really standing across from. Amanda stood beside me, flipping calmly through our documents. Pop's water covenant, the EPA inspection report, flow rate data, Historical photos of the creek, and the kicker, Rick's recorded phone call, fuming about campaign contributions and threats. "Let them bring their theatrics," she whispered. "We'll bring the truth." Then the bailiff called the room to order. Judge Henry Walsh took the bench. His robe sat stiff on his shoulders like it didn't belong there. His eyes darted to Rick, who sat 2 rows back with a phone pressed flat against his thigh, texting furiously. The show had begun. Maggie's attorney opened with a dramatic flair. "Your Honor, we are here because a disturbed individual, a combat veteran with military-grade engineering knowledge, has chosen to weaponize a flood control structure against innocent families." He pointed at me like I was a ticking bomb. This man orchestrated what amounts to an act of domestic sabotage, over $2.7 million in estimated property damage, psychological trauma to residents, environmental destruction disguised as a restoration effort. He paused for effect, then nodded at the back of the room. The psychiatrist, clean suit, slick hair, stepped forward and took the stand. He introduced himself as a specialist in combat-related PTSD and post-deployment grievance projection. He'd never spoken to me, never interviewed me, but that didn't stop him. Individuals suffering from military hypervigilance, he said, often seek control over perceived injustices. They may lash out with symbolic acts. In this case, weaponizing water to compensate for loss of battlefield agency. I watched the gallery as he spoke. Maggie's side nodded solemnly. But the rest leaned back, arms crossed, skeptical. They'd seen the water, touched it, watched it bring gardens back to life and stock ponds back from the dead. This wasn't an outburst, it was repair. Maggie's attorney concluded with a request for immediate restraining orders, a full investigation into my mental state, and an injunction to shut down all dam operations indefinitely. Then Amanda stood, and the tide shifted. She opened Pop's journal and read aloud. "Opened spillway today. Helped the Santos family and 3 others get through the dry spell. That's what neighbors do." Then she walked through the 1978 Agricultural Water Covenant, the 1923 Senior Water Rights Deed, the federal flood management permits signed off by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. She didn't shout, didn't dramatize. She just laid out the law, like bricks in a foundation. "Your Honor," she said, "this isn't environmental terrorism. This is environmental stewardship, federally protected and legally mandated." Then she called the witnesses. Agent Sarah Kim from the EPA took the stand and confirmed everything. The dam meets all safety standards. The spillway operation restored water flow to original channels. No residential property was damaged. And the defendant operated entirely within the parameters of federal oversight. Rick's attorney squirmed. Then came the surprise. Tony Riggs walked into the courtroom in uniform. He introduced himself as the lead EPA enforcement officer overseeing the investigation into Willowbrook's creek diversion and potential Clean Water Act violations. He testified about the sabotage, the falsified environmental assessments, the unpermitted redirection of a federally protected waterway. But when Amanda played Rick's recorded phone call, the entire room shifted. Get that. "Judge, to shut him down, or I swear I'll—" That was all it took. The judge leaned back, his fingers steepled under his chin. For the first time that morning, he looked nervous. Then Amanda did what Amanda does best. She called Rick to the stand. He tried to object, tried to leave, but under oath he had no way out. "Did you fast-track zoning changes for the Willowbrook development while the defendant was deployed overseas? I don't recall." "Let me refresh your memory." She handed him city records with his signature on every expedited approval. "Did you invest financially in the construction company building on that land?" He hesitated. Yes. Did you ever recuse yourself from city council votes related to that land? No. The gallery gasped. Then Amanda dropped the hammer. She presented EPA documents from Rick's previous project in Houston, the one that paid a $2.3 million fine for illegal creek diversion. Signed by Rick. Managed by Maggie. This, Amanda said, is not a one-time incident. It's a pattern. A systemic abuse of authority, land theft, insurance fraud, and environmental destruction. The courtroom went silent until Miguel stood. I lost my family's farm because of that creek diversion. Then Mrs. Chen. My garden fed 4 generations. It died when the water stopped. Testimony after testimony followed. Neighbors, farmers, ranchers, even a wildlife ecologist who documented the loss of native species from the blocked waterway. This wasn't a flood. It was restoration. Maggie's turn came last. She took the stand like a queen unjustly accused. He came back from war. Broken, she said, her voice trembling. He threatened me. He hates this community. Amanda calmly approached. Did you hire security to sabotage the dam controls? No. Then how do you explain this? She clicked her laptop. Footage. Played. 2 men in tactical gear. One pouring concrete into the spillway, the other keeping watch. The timestamp matched Maggie's security schedule. Her face cracked. This is a setup. Amanda cut her off. The only thing set up, ma'am, is your development. Built on a lie, funded by fraud, and now exposed under oath. Then, the final blow. Amanda presented satellite imagery showing the flood zone had never touched a single home. EPA measurements confirming flow matched natural seasonal averages. And drone footage of the dam operating under Army Corps design specs. Judge Walsh had heard enough. He cleared his throat, then spoke directly into the silence. This court finds no evidence of malicious flooding. The defendant acted under federally protected agricultural water rights. All injunctions are denied. He turned to Rick. And I am referring this matter to the U.S. Attorney's Office for potential prosecution. The gavel dropped like thunder. Maggie didn't wait to be escorted out. She stormed past reporters, sunglasses back on, phone glued to her ear, already calling someone, anyone, who might still believe her story. But her empire had already cracked. And the water? The water was still flowing. Some collapses make a sound. Others make silence. When that gavel dropped, Maggie didn't scream. She didn't protest. She didn't offer a final, teary-eyed rebuttal. She just walked. Out the courtroom doors. Past the cameras. Down the marble. Steps of the courthouse that used to protect her power. Her heels clacked like war drums on concrete. Her designer handbag clutched like a shield that wouldn't work anymore. And still, she believed it wasn't over. But it was. The narrative had shifted. The media who once parroted her "protect our kids" rhetoric now swarmed the farmers, the veterans, the environmental advocates. Headlines changed overnight. Veteran restores Stolen Creek, uncovers HOA corruption. Water rights hero. Sparks federal probe into Texas land fraud. And my favorite, sometimes you have to flood the valley to save the creek. Rick was arrested less than 48 hours later, not for zoning violations, not for the concrete trucks, for wire fraud. Turns out the banks funding Willowbrook Estates were misled with forged environmental assessments, falsified flood zone declarations, water stability guarantees that were, in reality, stolen infrastructure. Amanda. handed everything over to federal banking regulators. By the end of the week, the development's construction loans were frozen. $12 million. Gone overnight. But the most poetic part? The HOA's own insurance carrier voided every policy issued under false pretenses. Homeowners found out through certified letters and panicked phone calls. They weren't just uninsured, they were unprotected. A handful of residents packed up immediately. Moving trucks lined the new cul-de-sacs, engines idling while families carried out furniture, boxes, kids' bikes. One man looked at me with a face full of regret and whispered, "I thought they had permits." They did, just not for the truth. Meanwhile, Amanda and I weren't done. We formed a coalition, a real one. The Willow Creek Restoration Association, an alliance of every farmer, rancher, wildlife advocate, and longtime resident who'd been harmed by the diversion. Miguel Santos, Mrs. Chen, the Turners, who lost 2/3 of their harvest in 2023. The Diaz family, whose orchard hadn't produced a single viable crop since the creek went dry. We had stories, documentation, proof. But most importantly, we had each other. Amanda filed a federal civil RICO case. Racketeering, conspiracy, fraud. Because what Maggie and Rick had done wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a pattern. 6 other communities across Texas came forward. Similar stories, similar zoning mistakes, the same contractor names, the same consultants, the same trick. Claim the land is vacant, divert water, change zoning, push families out. And now, thanks to our case, they had a legal blueprint for how to fight back. EPA investigations widened. The U.S. Attorney's Office officially opened a probe into interstate environmental crimes involving water rights fraud. The phrase alone shook developers from Houston to El Paso. But none of that was what made me tear up. It was the creek. 3 weeks after the spillway opened, I walked with Miguel down to his family's pond. This time, there was no ceremony. No cameras. Just a quiet morning. Dew still clinging to the grass. The water shimmered like it remembered what it was made for. He knelt by the edge, scooped up a handful, and smiled. This is for my daughter, Maria Santos, 17 years old, honors student, and the first recipient of the Pops Morrison Environmental Scholarship, which Amanda and I launched with part of the insurance fraud settlement. She'd been accepted to UT Austin Environmental Engineering, said she wanted to make sure no one else's land is ever stolen drop by drop. I don't know if I've ever been prouder, not even in uniform, not even holding Pop's journal in my hand at that damn control, because this was what he built it for, not just to protect the land, to inspire those who would inherit it. Back. At the farmhouse, life took on a different rhythm. Sarah moved back from California, said she was tired of distance and wanted to help manage the land with both hands in the dirt. She brought composting bins, solar panels, and a bullet journal full of homestead management strategies. Pop would have called her a force of nature in yoga pants. Amanda started spending more time on the porch swing than in courtrooms. The kind of time that doesn't come with filings or deadlines. We didn't need to talk about it. It just was. I renovated the farmhouse using sustainable materials, rebuilt the porch Rick's inspector claimed was unfit for habitation, turned it into a wraparound deck where families could sit and watch the creek wind through their history. Mrs. Chen helped me design an edible garden. Miguel built a teaching arbor for crop rotation lessons. And every Sunday we filled the air with the smell of mesquite, brisket, and earth after rain. It wasn't just a farm anymore. It was a demonstration site, and people came from all over, community organizers, environmental lawyers, students, lawmakers, veterans who'd fought battles overseas and came home to find new ones waiting in their own neighborhoods. And everywhere they went, the water followed. Because Willow Creek was no longer just a trickle behind a dam. It was a movement. The Audubon Society documented the return of 12 bird species that hadn't nested in the area in over 5 years. Texas Parks and Wildlife designated the creek a critical wildlife corridor. Guadalupe bass, thought lost in the kill caused by the diversion, were spotted again, thriving. It turns out that when you return stolen water to its rightful path, everything grows. And Maggie? Well, Maggie filed for bankruptcy. Her $2.3 million estate on Sycamore Lane was repossessed after she lost the insurance fraud lawsuit. Her name disappeared from every HOA she'd ever served. Last I heard, she was living in Florida and blaming social media terrorists for her downfall. Rick? Federal prison. 3 years for conspiracy and fraud. His construction company blacklisted from all federal contracts, and every developer associated with Willowbrook facing audit. But here's the twist that surprised even me. Some of the Willowbrook residents stayed, not because they supported Maggie, because they wanted to make it right. They voted to dissolve the HOA and formed a new community cooperative instead. One focused on stewardship, not control. They even reached out to the Restoration Association with an offer to fund wetland rehabilitation along the creek borders. That changed everything. Because healing doesn't come from punishment. It comes from participation. 6 months after the courtroom ruling, we held the first Creek Days Festival, a community celebration of water rights, environmental education, and rural resilience. Booths lined the old pasture. Kids fished in the creek. Local bands played under the restored pecan trees. And in the center, a photo of Pop, smiling in a fold-up chair. A mason jar of creek water in one hand, a sandwich in the other. We'd done it, old man. We'd kept it flowing. They say the ripple effect is just a metaphor, but I've seen it, not on paper, not in a spreadsheet, in the real world. In the way one creek, once blocked and buried by greed, found its way home. And with it, everything that had been lost after. The courtroom victory. The floodgates didn't just open for water. They opened for truth, and people noticed. Environmental groups started calling. At first, it was just 1 or 2. Conservation folks from neighboring counties asking about the legal filings, the restoration process. Then came the researchers, the policy writers, then the veterans. Always the veterans. They saw what I saw. That. The same precision we learned to apply overseas could rebuild what was being destroyed back home. Just without bullets, without raids, without orders shouted across radios. Just knowledge, documentation, courage, and timing. Amanda and I built a case study with the Army Corps of Engineers, Willow Creek versus Willowbrook HOA, a model for grassroots enforcement of federal water law. That title started appearing everywhere. On environmental panels, in urban planning courses, even in federal guidance documents. One afternoon, a representative from the Department of the Interior called. She said they wanted to cite our story in a national wetlands restoration initiative. She called it one of the cleanest grassroots water justice victories in recent history. I just called it Pop's legacy, but not everyone understood what had happened. Some people still wanted it simple. HOA bad, veteran flood suburb, happy ending. But this wasn't about villains and heroes. This was about a system, a machine of zoning. Codes and quiet corruption that only worked when no one paid attention, and people had been trained not to pay attention until now. 3 months after Rick's sentencing, we helped file 6 new water rights cases on behalf of small landowners across Texas. All 6 cited the Willow Creek model. All 6 had veterans involved. It turns out when you train someone to rebuild wells in Kandahar, they know how to rebuild justice in a county courthouse too. But it wasn't just legal filings, it was lives. The Diaz family, who had nearly lost their orchard. Their trees began bearing again, the first crop in 2 years. Their daughter, Sophia, presented Amanda with a peach the size of her palm, said it was for the lady who brought the water back. Mrs. Chen turned her restored garden into a teaching center for sustainable agriculture. Local schools brought students to see how water systems worked, how runoff shaped crops, how soil healed with time and care. And Miguel, he didn't just rebuild his pond. He rebuilt his faith. We used a portion of the lawsuit settlement to buy back Miguel's family farm at the tax auction. I handed him the keys myself. He didn't say anything at first. Just stood on that porch, the same one he'd built with his father decades ago, and cried. Then, without a word, he reached into the pocket of his worn jeans, pulled out a yellowed photo of his grandfather, and clipped it back onto the wall above the fireplace. "No more fighting to get home," he said. "We're home again." That was what it had always been about. Not destroying anything, restoring everything. Sarah and I planted a pecan tree just uphill from the dam. Pop always said pecans were stubborn. They took years to grow, but when they did, they stayed. That's what we were doing now, planting things that would outlive us. The Willow Creek Conservation Trust was born 2 months later. A permanent buffer zone across the watershed, protected from future commercial development, backed by local ordinances, and conservation easements. We partnered with Texas Parks and Wildlife, the Sierra Club, and the Guadalupe Base Restoration Project. Within months, native fish populations rebounded to pre-diversion levels. Bird migration patterns returned. Even the frogs, long silent in the dried-up reeds, sang again under moonlight. And that creek flowed stronger than ever. But here's what truly brought me peace: the sound of laughter. Children playing in the water, where once a concrete wall had choked off its life. Veterans wading in with fishing poles, teaching others how to tie a knot or gut a trout. Grandparents sitting beneath shade trees, telling stories about what the creek used to be like before someone tried to bury it for good. It was life returning. Not loudly, not suddenly, just naturally, as it always should have. Amanda and I sat on the porch most nights, her laptop closed, her phone on silent. She started bringing tea instead of legal briefs. I brought quiet instead of battle plans. The house, once a war room, was now a home again. And then the letters started arriving. From Florida, Georgia, Colorado, Arizona, homeowners, farmers, tribal leaders, veterans, all telling the same story in different words. They're diverting our water. The zoning changed without notice. They say we don't have rights because no one fought them before. And every time I read one, I heard the same echo in my head, Pop's voice. Sometimes the strongest people are the ones who stay silent the longest. But now? Now they were writing, reaching out, ready to fight. So we built something for them, the Water Rights Legal Defense Fund, a non-profit coalition of environmental attorneys, engineers, and veterans trained to defend landowners against unlawful diversion, HOA overreach, and developer fraud. We staffed it with people who knew what it meant to lose something you thought no one could ever take. Our first case in Arizona, Settled in 13 days, a homeowner coalition in New Mexico won back 700 acres and 2 miles of stolen stream, a tribal community in Nevada regained ancestral rights to a spring diverted by a luxury golf resort. Every one of them used our legal blueprint, and every one of them thanked the Willow Creek fight for showing what was possible. We didn't just free our own land, we showed people how to protect theirs. But that momentum wasn't just in courtrooms. It showed up in classrooms. We expanded the Pops Morrison Environmental Scholarship to include trade students and veterans retraining in hydrology, law, and civil engineering. The first class had 11 recipients. 3 of them had served in Iraq. 1 had been a farmer's son. 2 had lived under HOA control their entire lives and wanted to do more than complain. They wanted to change the system, and they were. One of them, a woman named Lila Harper, designed a floodplain reclamation system now being adopted in 4 counties. Another, Jamal Torres, joined Amanda as a junior paralegal and filed his first injunction at 23. I watched all of this happen from the same porch Pop used to sit on with his thermos and binoculars. I could almost see him in the corner of my eye sometimes, nodding with that quiet pride that didn't need words, because justice had found a new path, and just like water, it was flowing. You don't always know the last time you'll fight. It doesn't come with fanfare. There's no final trumpet, no flags waving on a hilltop. Sometimes, it comes on a quiet Sunday morning when you're carrying a mason jar full of creek water to a headstone beneath a pecan tree. "Creek's still singing, Pop," I whispered. "You were right. You always were." That jar sat just where he used to place it. The stone smooth, the engraving clean. Harold Pops, Morrison, 1927. 2013, he let the water run true. I stood there for a while listening. The creek flowed just over the ridge. Birdsong carried on the breeze. Somewhere down the hill, laughter from kids splashing by the spillway. No one called it a dam anymore. They called it the heartbeat. And in a way, it was. The final chapter of Willow Creek wasn't about courtrooms or permits or arrests. That had all been written. Maggie Thornwell's name became a cautionary tale. Rick's construction company dissolved under federal sanction. Every family who'd lost access to water now had it restored and protected in writing. But that wasn't the ending. That was just justice. The ending was renewal. 6 months after the courtroom victory, the Willow Creek Days Festival became an annual event. What started as a small gathering of neighbors and supporters exploded into a statewide celebration. The fields bloomed with community booths, homemade pies, indigenous art, veterans' crafts, conservation demos. A solar-powered stage hosted everything from bluegrass to Tejano to high school jazz bands. The air smelled like smoked brisket, sage, and garden herbs. Kids ran around with paper fish cutouts, part of a scavenger hunt designed to teach them about Guadalupe bass, their migration patterns, and how close they came to disappearing. But they didn't, because someone opened the gate in time. During the first Creek Days ceremony, Amanda stood in front of the crowd, her voice proud but trembling, and introduced someone unexpected. Sarah, my sister. She wore her jeans tucked into boots now. Her hands bore soil stains. She'd taken over the agritourism business full-time, helped coordinate educational tours, heritage events, and seasonal farm stays. But on that stage, she didn't talk about any of that. She just held up Pop's old notebook, the one we'd nearly lost in a box of waterlogged storage, and said, "This is the legacy of a man who thought water was meant to be shared, not sold." This land didn't just survive a flood, it survived people who forgot how to listen. The crowd stood silent for a beat. Then they clapped. Not for the victory, but for the memory. For what we almost lost and what we still had. 1 year after the gates opened, we released a documentary with the Department of the Interior, The Water Returns, the Willow Creek Reclamation. Narrated by a combat veteran, filmed by environmental students, premiered at 5 film festivals, and after every showing came letters, hundreds of them, from towns you've never heard of. Our creek was diverted for a golf course. My grandmother's well ran dry after the subdivision expanded. They told us it was legal. It didn't feel legal. We answered everyone, not because we had all the solutions, but because they deserved to know they weren't crazy, that their memories mattered, that their water mattered. The Water Rights Legal Defense Fund grew from 6 staff members to 24. Amanda trained 5 new attorneys in environmental fraud detection. Jamal, our first intern, passed the bar and now leads regional outreach. Our Veterans Division now includes engineers, surveyors, and former water management officers. They don't just fight in courtrooms, they help design sustainable systems to protect what's already flowing. Because that's the real mission. Not to punish, to preserve. The Willow Creek property was permanently donated to the Willow Creek Conservation Trust, protected under a 99-year agreement that prevents any form of commercial development across the watershed. A permanent home for flow, a permanent home for community. And me? I still live in Pop's farmhouse, but it doesn't feel like a battlefield anymore. The war is over. There are mornings when I just sit on the porch with my coffee and stare at the water as it curls around the bend, catching sunlight like silver thread. I listen to the frogs, the owls, the low hum of bees in the wildflowers we planted by the banks. And I remember the fear, the anger, the bureaucratic sabotage, the mental health accusations, the lies, the corruption. The nights I thought I was the only one who saw it happening. And I remember the moment that all changed, when one creek came home and reminded everyone who was watching that truth, like water, doesn't vanish. It just waits for the right moment, the right gate, the right person willing to say, enough. This year, Maria Santos, Miguel's daughter, graduates from UT Austin. She's accepted a position with the U.S. Geological Survey, specializing in watershed restoration. Her final project was titled The Hydrology of Hope, Environmental Resilience in Willow Creek. She dedicated it to my abuelo and to the man who opened the gates. I read that line about 5 times before I set the paper down and cried like a child. Not because I was proud. Because I finally understood what Pop had seen when he built that dam with his own hands. He didn't just see water. He saw the people who would need it, who would depend on it, who would one day stand where he stood and face what he never could have predicted. A world where the very idea of shared water became a threat to someone's profit margin. And he prepared. Not with lawyers, with clay, steel, and quiet faith. Faith that someone would come back and remember. I do, Pop, every day. So to anyone watching this, anyone out there fighting an HOA, a developer, a zoning board that doesn't listen, here's what I'll tell you. Document everything. Never sign anything you don't understand. Find your allies. They're out there. In your neighborhood, online, in the courthouse records. And most of all, don't let them take your water. Because when they take your water, they're not just stealing land. They're stealing history. your grandfather's hands, your garden's breath, your child's future. So fight smart, fight steady, and when the time comes, open the gate. Let it flow. Let the truth return to where it always belonged. Final closing lines for voiceover narration, so drop a comment. If you've ever fought an HOA and won, or if you're fighting right now, I read everyone. Subscribe if you want more stories about land, power, and people who don't back down. Next week, I'm telling you about a woman who cut power to City Hall during the mayor's wedding because they tried to steal her solar farm. It's a different kind of power and a different kind of justice. But the truth always finds a way, just like water does. Willow Creek flows free, y'all, and it always will.